Chapter 6 of Sex. Avoided Subjects Discussed in Plain English by Henry Stanton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Sex in the Adolescent Female. From Puberty to Maturity. Adolescence in the girl is the period when she develops into a woman. It is that stage in female life embraced between the ages of 12 or 14 and 21 years. Elasticity of body, a clear complexion, and a happy control of her feelings should mark the young girl at this time, if she has been so fortunate as to escape the dangers and baneful influences of childhood and infancy. Her numerous bodily functions should be well performed. Thus constituted, she should be in a condition to take up her coming struggle with the world and the sex problem it will present. Puberty. It has been noticed that in the case of girls, puberty usually occurs earlier in brunettes than in blondes. In general, it makes its appearance earlier in those of a nervous or bilo-nervous temperament than in those whose temperament is phlegmatic or lymphatic. In the United States, 14½ years is the usual age of puberty in girls. In tropical lands, however, it is not uncommon for a girl to be a mother at 12. Country girls and boys usually mature several months or a year later than those living in cities. Too early a puberty in girls may well arouse concern. It usually indicates some inherent constitutional weakness. Premature puberty is often associated with premature decay. The signs and changes of puberty. In the girl, the sign of puberty is the growth of hair about the pubes, private organs, and armpits. Her whole frame remains more slender than in the male. Muscles and joints are less prominent, limbs more rounded and tapering. Internal and external organs undergo rapid enlargement locally. The mammae, the breasts, enlarge, the ovaries dilate, and a periodical uteral discharge, menstruation, is established. Menstruation. No young girl should feel alarmed if, owing to the negligence of her parents or guardians to prepare her, she is surprised by this first flow from the genital organs. Puberty is the proper time for the appearance of menstruation. This is the periodical development and discharge of an ovule, one or more, by the female, accompanied by the discharge of a fluid known as menses or catamenia. Menstruation, in general good health, should occur about every 28 days or once in 4 weeks. This rule, however, is subject to great variation. Menstruation continues from puberty to about the 45th year, which usually marks the menopause or change of life. When it disappears, a woman is no longer capable of bearing children. Her period of fertility has passed. In rare cases, menstruation has stopped at 35 or lasted till 30. Hints for observance during menstruation. When the period arrives, a girl or woman has a feeling of discomfort and lassitude. There is a sense of weight and a disinclination for society. Menstruation should not, however, be regarded as a nuisance. A girl's friends respect her most when she is unwell. She should keep more than usually quiet while the flow continues, which it will do for a few days. Also, she should avoid all unnecessary fatigue, exposure to wet, or to extremes of temperature. Some girls are guilty of the crime of trying to arrest the menstruation flow and resorting to methods of stopping it. Why? In order to attend a dance or pleasure excursion. Lives have been lost by thus suppressing the monthly flux. Mothers should instruct their daughters when the menses are apt to begin and what their function is. During menstruation, great care must be taken in using water internally. A chill is sufficient to arrest the flow. If menstruation does not establish itself in a healthy or normal manner at the proper time, consult a physician in order to remove this abnormal condition. Any disturbance of the delicate menstrual functions during the period by constrained positions, muscular effort, brain work, and mental or physical excitement is apt to have serious consequences. Continence and the young adolescent girl. Continence is, as a rule, more easily observed by the adolescent girl than by the adolescent youth. Ordinarily, the normal young girl has no undue sexual propensities, amorous thoughts, or feelings. Though she is exposed to the danger of meeting other girls who may be lewd in thought and speech, in the houses of friends or at school, she is not apt to be carried away by their example. Yet, even a good, pure-minded young girl may be debauched. Especially during adolescence, the easy observance of natural continence depends greatly on the proper functioning of the female genital organs. These may be easily disturbed. The syringe used for injections for so-called purposes of cleanliness is in reality a danger. The inner organs are self-cleansing. Water or other fluids cast into them disorder the mucous follicles and dry up their secretions, preventing the flowing out of some of nature's necessities. A daily washing of the inner organs for a long period with water also produces chronic leucorrhea. Why young girls fall. Lack of proper early training, abnormal sex instincts, weak good nature, poverty, all may be responsible for a young girl's moral downfall. As a general thing, right home training and home environment and sane sex education will prevent the normally good girl from going wrong. It should be remembered, though, that a naturally more gentle and yielding disposition may easily lead her into temptation. Girls who are sentimentally inclined should beware of giving way to advances on the part of young men which have only one object in view, the gratification of their animal passion. The holding of hands and similar innocent beginnings often pave the way for more familiar caresses. Passionate kisses, the promiscuous kiss, by the way, may be the carrier of that dread infection, syphilis, violently awaken a young girl's sex instincts. The fact is that many innocent girls idealize their seducers. They believe their lying promises actually come to love them, and think that in gratifying their inflamed desires, they are giving proof of the depth and purity of their own affection. Here, as in the case of the young man, self-control should be the first thing cultivated. And self-control should be made doubly sure by never permitting one of the opposite sex to show undue familiarity. Many a seemingly innocent flirtation, begun with a kiss, has ended in shame and disgrace, in loss of social standing and position, venereal disease, or even death. The pure-minded and innocent girl often becomes a victim of her ignorance of the consequences entailed by giving in to the desires of some male companion. The girl who has a knowledge of sex facts is less apt to be taken advantage of in this manner. Modern conditions which encourage immorality. Excessive freedom. The excessive freedom granted the young girl, especially since the World War, must be held responsible for a great increase in familiarity between the adolescent youth of both sexes. Many young girls of the flapper type, in particular, are victims of these conditions of unrestrained sex association. Sex precocity is furthered in coeducational colleges, in the high school, and the home. Adolescents of both sexes, too, often are practically unhampered in their comings and goings, their words and actions. The surreptitious pocket flask filled with hooch is often a feature of social parties, dances, and affairs frequented by young people. Girls and boys drink together, and as alcohol weakens moral resistance in the one case and stimulates desire in the other, deplorable consequences naturally result. In the United States, The number of girls sent home from colleges and of high school girls being privately treated by physicians to save them from disgrace is incredibly large. Parents who do not control the social activities of their daughters, who permit them to spend their evenings away from home with only a general idea of what they are doing or whom they are meeting, need not be surprised if their morals are undermined. The auto. The advent of the automobile is responsible for an easy and convenient manner of satisfying precociously aroused sex instincts in young girls and boys. Often unconscientious pleasure seekers roam the roads in their auto. They accost girls who are walking and offer them a lift. When the latter refuse to gratify their desires, they are often beaten and flung from the car. The daily press has given such publicity to this civilized form of headhunting that it is difficult to sympathize with girls who are thus treated. They cannot help but know that in 9 cases out of 10, a stranger who invites them to ride, who picks them up, does so with the definite purpose already mentioned in view. Poverty. Poverty, too, plays a large role in driving young girls into a life of vice. In all our large cities there are hundreds of young women who earn hardly enough to buy food and fuel and pay for the rent of a room in a cheap lodging house. Feminine youth longs for dress, for company, for entertainment. It is easy enough to find a gentleman friend who will provide all three in exchange for companionship. So the bargain is struck. These conditions exist in 101 occupations. A young woman may go to a large city as pure as snow, but finding no lucrative employment, lonely and despondent, she is led to take her first step on the downward path. Soon, daily contact with vice removes abhorrence to it. Familiarity makes it habitual, and another life is ruined. The heartless moral code of the cynical young pleasure-seeking male is summed up in the cant phrase about women: find and forget. It is these girls who are victimized by their lack of self-restraint or moral principle, their ignorance or weakness, who make possible the application of such a maxim. Virginity. Both mental and physical purity are rightfully required of the young girl about to marry. How shall she acquire and maintain this desirable state of purity? The process is a simple one. She must let a knowledge of true hygienic and moral laws of her sex guide her in her relations with men. She must cultivate clean thought on a basis of physical cleanliness. She need not be ignorant to be pure. Men she should study carefully. She should not allow them to sit with their arm about her waist, to hold her hand, to kiss her. No approach nor touch beyond what the best social observance sanctions should be permitted. Even the tendernesses and familiarities of courtship should be restrained. An engagement does not necessarily culminate in a marriage, and once the foot has slipped on virtue's path, the error cannot be recalled. These considerations, together with those adduced in the preceding section, Why Young Girls Fall, are well worth taking to heart by every young woman who wishes to approach matrimony in the right and proper way. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Sex. Avoided Subjects Discussed in Plain English by Henry Stanton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Sex in the Marriage Relation. The Husband. Marriage is the process by which a man and woman enter into a complete physical, legal, and moral union. The natural object of marriage is the complete community of life for the establishment of a family. The marriageable age and adaptation. At 24, The male body attains its complete development, and 25 is a proper age for the young man to marry. Romantic love, personal affection on a basis of congeniality, mutual adaptation, a similar social sphere of life should determine his choice. Nature and custom indicate that the husband should be somewhat older than the wife. Men who should not marry. Men suffering with diseases which may be communicated by contagion or heredity should not marry. These diseases include tuberculosis, syphilis, cancer, leprosy, epilepsy, and some nervous disorders, some skin diseases, and insanity. A worn-out rake has no business to marry, since marriage is not a hospital for the treatment of disease, or a reformatory institution for moral lepers. Those having a marked tendency to disease must not marry those of similar tendency. The marriage of cousins is not to be advocated. The blood relation tends to bring together persons with similar morbid tendencies. Where both are healthy, however, there seems to be no special liability to mental incompetency, though such marriages are accused of producing defective or idiot children. Men suffering from congenital defects should not marry. Natural blindness, deafness, muteness, and congenital deformities of limb are more or less likely to be passed on to their children. There are cases of natural blindness, though, to which this rule does not apply. Criminals, alcoholics, and persons disproportionate in size should not marry. In the last mentioned, lack of mutual physical adaptability may produce much unhappiness, especially on the part of the wife. Serious local disease, sterility, and great risk in childbirth may result. Disparity of years, disparity of race, a poverty which will not permit the proper raising of children, undesirable moral character are all good reasons for not marrying. Medical examination before marriage. Medical examination as a preliminary to marriage is practically more valuable than a marriage license. Since many entirely innocent young girls today suffer from disease incurred either through hereditary or accidental infection, a would-be husband may be said to be quite as much entitled to protection as his bride-to-be. Prohibitive physical defects are also discovered in this connection. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Sex. Avoided Subjects Discussed in Plain English by Henry Stanton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Sex in the Marriage Relation. The Wife. Girls marry, in the final analysis, because love for the male is an innate natural principle of the female nature. At its best, this love is pure and chaste. The good woman realizes that its first purpose is not mere carnal pleasure. It is a special avowal of the wife's relations to her husband, and its natural as well as moral end is the establishment of the family on the basis of a healthy progeny. Before marriage. The wife-to-be, like her prospective husband, will be well advised to ask for a medical health certificate. No man, no matter how good his reputation may be, should marry, on his own account as well as that of the girl, without thorough examination by a physician. The consequences of venereal infection administered to unborn children by their parents are too horrible to allow of any risk being taken. Another bit of advice, which cannot be too highly commended, is that the prospective husband and wife, before they marry, have a plain talk with each other regarding individual sexual peculiarities and needs. A heart-to-heart talk of this kind would be apt to prevent great disappointments and incompatibilities which otherwise may become permanent. The wife and her position. The natural instinct of a man is to seek his mate. On her he depends for an orderly and lawful indulgence of his sex demands. The greatest longevity and best health are to be found among happily married fathers and mothers. No young woman should marry without a full knowledge of her sex duties to her husband, and she should never consummate the marriage vow grudgingly. Childbirth hygiene. Childbirth is the natural consequence of marriage. Its processes have already been explained in Chapter 2 of this book. There are, however, some hygienic facts in connection with it which should be noted. Once pregnancy is established, as soon as the fact is suspected, the mother-to-be should look on the little embryo as already a member of the family. Every act of each parent should now be performed, at least to some degree, with reference to the forthcoming infant. The mother's thoughts should be directed to it as much as possible. Mentally, she should read literature of a lofty and ennobling character. The theory is that this serves a good purpose in producing a more perfect, healthy, and intelligent child. Physically, she should take plenty of active exercise during gestation. Active exercise does not, of course, mean violent exercise, and she should use a health lift. During this time, she should subsist, as far as possible, on a farinaceous diet, fruits and vegetables. The foods should be plainly cooked without spices. If all else is as it should be, the birth of the child at the end of the customary 9 months will be attended by comparatively little pain and danger. How often should childbirth take place? It is important that the childbearing wife and mother have a long period of rest between births. At least 1 year should separate a birth and the conception following it. This means that about 2 years should elapse between 2 births. If this rule be followed, the wife will retain her health, and her children will also be healthy. It is far better to give birth to 7 children who will live and be healthy, than to bear 14, of whom 7 are likely to die, while the numerous successive births wear out and age the unfortunate mother. Matrimonial adjustment. The above paragraph deals with one detail of what might be called matrimonial adjustment. This adjustment, or compromise, is a feature of all successful marriages. The individual cravings of husband and wife must be reconciled by mutual goodwill and forbearance if they are to be happy. Attention should be paid in particular to not allowing habit, the worst foe of married happiness, to become too well established in the home, and to cultivate that love and affection which survives the decline of the sexual faculties. The ideal marriage. The ideal marriage is the one in which affection combines to bring happiness to both partners in a sane union of sex and soul. As one commentator has rather unhappily expressed it, when married, the battle for one united and harmonious life really begins. It is indeed but too often a battle. Forbearance, consideration, and respect must be the foundation on which the ideal married state is built. The husband should realize that his wife's love for him induces her to allow privileges of a personal nature which her innate chastity and timidity might otherwise refuse. In return, he should accept these privileges with consideration. He should, in particular, on his wedding night, take care not to shock his young bride's sensibilities. He may easily give her a shock from which she will not recover for years, and lead her to form an antipathy against the very act which is the bond and seal of a truly happy married life. Birth control. Material changes have taken place in the birth rate of a number of countries during the past 15 or 20 years, which cannot be attributed to purely economic causes. They do not seem to depend on such things as trade, employment, and prices, but on the spread of an idea or influence whose tendency must be deplored, that of birth control, a phrase much heard in these days. The fact that a decline in human fertility and a falling birth rate are most noticeable in the relatively prosperous countries is a proof that it does not proceed from economic causes, but is due rather to the spread of the doctrine that it is permissible to restrict or control birth. In such countries as the United States, England, and Australia, where the standards of human comfort and living are notoriously high, the decline in the birth rate has been most noticeable. On the other hand, we find perhaps the greatest decline in the birth rate in France, a country where the general well-being probably reaches a lower depth in the community than in any other part of Europe. A comparison of the birth rates of France and of Ireland, for example, offer a valuable illustration of the point under consideration. In France, more than half the women who have reached the age of nubility are married. In Ireland, generally speaking, less than a third. In both countries, the crude birth rate is far below that in other European lands. Yet the fertility of the Irish wife exceeded that of her French compeer by 44% in 1880 and by no less than 84% in 1900. And since that time, the prolificity of the Irish mother has so increased that she is now, approximately speaking, inferior only to the Dutch or Finnish mother in this respect. In general, in any country where we find a diminished prolificity, a falling off of childbirth unaccompanied by a decrease in the number of marriages occurring at the reproductive ages, we may attribute this decrease to voluntary restriction of childbearing on the part of the married, or in other words, to the prevalence of birth control. This, incidentally, is not a theoretical statement, but one supported by the almost unanimous medical opinion in all countries. Everywhere, and especially here in our own United States, we find evidence of the extensive employ of birth control measures to prevent that normal development of family life which underlies the vigor and racial power of every nation. These preventative measures, which arbitrarily control human birth, had long been in use in France with results which, especially since the war, have been frequently and publicly deplored in the press, and have led the French government to offer substantial rewards to encourage the propagation of large families. From France, the preventive practices of birth control had spread after 1870 over nearly all the countries of Western Europe, to England and to the United States, though they are not as much apparent in those countries where the Roman Church has a strong hold on the people. As a general thing, the practice of thus unnaturally limiting families, unnaturally, since the custom of birth control derives from no natural physical law, prevails, in the first instance among the well-to-do, who should rather be the first to set the example of protest against it by having the families that are so much better able to support and educate than those less favored with the world's goods. If the evil of voluntary control of human birth were restricted to a privileged class, say one of wealth, the harm done would perhaps not be so great. But unfortunately, in the course of time, it filters down as a gospel of comfort, erroneous term, to those whose resources are less. They accept and practice this invidious system of prevention, and gradually the entire community is more or less affected. The whole system of birth control is opposed to natural, human, and religious law. Nature, in none of her manifestations, introduces anything which may tend to prevent her great reason for being, the propagation of the species. Birth, as the natural sequence of mating, is her solemn and invariable law. It is in birth and rebirth that nature renews herself and all the life of the animal and vegetable world, and her primal aim is to encourage it. Human law recognizes this underlying law of nature by forbidding man to tamper in a preventative way with her hallowed and mysterious processes for perpetuating the human race. Religious law, based on the divine dispensation of the Scriptures, endorses the law of nature and that of the state. We may take it then that birth control represents a deliberate and reprehensible attempt to nullify those innate laws of reproduction sanctioned by religion, tradition, and man's own ingrained instinct. To say that the human instinct for the perpetuation of his race and family has become atrophied during the flight of time, and that he is therefore justified in denying it, is merely begging the question. The instinct may be denied, just as other higher and nobler instincts are disregarded, but its validity cannot be questioned. Whether those who practice birth control are influenced by economic, selfishly personal, or other reasons, they are offending in a threefold manner against the inborn wish and desire which is a priceless possession of even the least of God's creatures, that of living anew in its offspring, against the law of the state, which after all stands for the crystallization of the best feeling of the community, and against the divine injunction handed down to us in Holy Writ to increase and multiply. Birth control is the foe to the direct end and aim of marriage, which in the last analysis is childbirth. As an enemy to the procreation of children, it is an enemy of the family and the family group. As an enemy of the family, it is an enemy of the state, the community, a foe of the whole social system. Mankind has been able to attain its comparatively recent state of moral and physical advancement without having recourse to the dangerous principle which birth control represents. Surely that wise provision of our existing legal code, which makes the printing or dissemination of information regarding the physical facts of birth control illegal and punishable as an offense, can only be approved by those who respect the omnipotent will and the time-hallowed traditions which date back to the very inception of the race. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Sex. Avoided subjects discussed in plain English by Henry Stanton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Sex diseases. The sex diseases are the same in both sexes, whether developed by direct or accidental infection. They are the greatest practical argument in favor of continence, morality, and marriage in the sex relation. Gonorrhea. Gonorrhea is a pus-discharging inflammation of the canal known as the urethra, which, passing through the entire length of the organ, carries both the urine and the seminal fluid. It is caused by a venereal bacillus, the gonococcus. Under favorable conditions and with right treatment, gonorrhea may be cured, though violently painful, in 14 days. Often the inflammation extends, becomes chronic, and attacks other organs. This chronic gonorrhea often causes permanent contraction of the urethra, which leads to the painful retention of urine, catarrh of the bladder, and stone. Chronic gonorrhea, too, often ends in death, especially if the kidneys are attacked. A cured case of gonorrhea does not mean immunity from further attacks. New infections are all the more easily acquired. Gonorrhea has even more dangerous consequences in women than in men. The gonococcus bacilli infect all the inner female genital organs. They cause frequent inflammations and lead to growths in the belly. Women thus attacked are apt to be sterile. They suffer agonies and often become chronic invalids. The child born of a gonorrheal mother while passing through the infected genital organs, comes to life with infected eyelids. This is blennorrhea, which may result in total blindness. Gonorrhea also causes inflammation of the joints, gonorrheal rheumatism, testicular inflammations which may lead to sterility. Some authorities claim that fully half of the sterility in women is caused by gonorrheal infection of the fallopian tubes. Gonorrheal infection of the eyes at birth is now prevented by first washing them in a saturated solution of boric acid, then treating them with a drop of weak silver solution. Syphilis. Syphilis is a still more terrible venereal disease. It usually appears first in small, hard sores, hard cankers, on the sexual parts or the mouth. Then the syphilitic poison spreads throughout the whole body by means of the blood. After a few weeks it breaks out on the face or body. Its final cure is always questionable. Syphilis may lie dormant for years and then suddenly become active again. It breaks out in sores on all parts of the body, often eats up the bone, destroys internal organs such as the liver, causes hardening of the lungs, diseases of the blood vessels, and eye diseases. Ulcers of the brain and nerve paralysis often result from it. One of its most terrible consequences is consumption of the spinal marrow and paralysis of the brain, or paresis. The first slowly hardens and destroys the spinal marrow, the second the brain. These diseases are only developed by previous syphilitics. As a rule, they occur from 5 to 20 years after infection, usually 10 or 15 years after it, and they usually happen to persons who believed themselves completely cured. Consumption of the spinal marrow leads to death in the course of a few years of continual torture. Paralysis of the brain turns the sufferer into a human ruin, gradually extinguishing all mental and nervous functions, sentience, movement, speech, and intellect. One danger of syphilis is the fact that its true nature may be overlooked during the first period, because of the lack of pronounced symptoms. Its early sores may easily be mistaken for some skin affection. Mercury and other means are successful in doing away with at least the more noticeable signs of syphilis during the first and secondary stages. The modern medical treatment using mercury and salvarsan, 606 in alteration, has been very successful. It is claimed that by following it, syphilis may be totally cured if taken in hand during the first stage. The sores developed during the first 2 or 3 years of the disease are very infectious. In the case of chronic syphilis of 3 or 4 years standing, the sores as a rule are no longer infectious. It is possible, however, for a syphilitic of this description to bring forth syphilitic children without infecting his wife. Such children either die at birth or later of this congenital syphilis. They may also die of spinal consumption or paresis between the ages of 10 and 20. The mortality of all syphilitic children is very great. In most cases, however, healthy children are born of the wedlock of relatively cured syphilitics, though they are often sterile. Young men who have had recourse to prostitutes often inoculate their wives with gonorrhea or syphilis, and thus the plague is spread. The soft canker. The soft canker is the third form of venereal disease, the hard canker being the first stage of syphilis. It is the least dangerous of the venereal diseases, but unfortunately, relatively the one which occurs most seldom. When not complicated with syphilis, it appears locally. It is a larger or smaller sore feeding and growing on the genital organs. Venereal disease, an advocate of continence. The most tragic consequence of all venereal disease is the part it plays in the infection of innocent children and innocent wives and mothers. Often a pure and chaste woman is thus deprived in the most cruel and brutal manner of the fruit of all her hopes and dreams of happiness. Similarly, a young man may find himself hopelessly condemned to a short life of pain and misery. He may also suffer from the knowledge that he has ruined the lives of those dearest to him. Venereal disease, syphilis in particular, emphasizes the practical value of continence, quite aside from its moral one, in a manner which cannot be ignored. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Sex. Avoided subjects discussed in plain English by Henry Stanton. Chapter 10. Love and Sex. When we take under consideration the higher, truer love of one sex for the other, that is, an affection which is not simply a friendship, but has a sex basis, we realize that it may be a very noble emotion. There is no matter of doubt but that the normal human being feels a great need for love. Sex in love and its manifestation in the life of the soul is one of the first conditions of human happiness and a main aim of human existence. All know the tale of Cupid's arrow. A man falls in love with a face, a pair of eyes, the sound of a voice, and his affection is developed from this trifling beginning until it takes complete possession of him. This love is usually made up of two components, a sex instinct and feelings of sympathy and interest which hark back to primal times. And this love, in its true sense, should stand for an affection purified from egoism. When, among the lower animal forms, we find individuals without a determined sex, egoism develops free from all restraint. Each individual creature devours as much as it can, and feeding, together with propagation by division, budding, or conjunction, makes up the total of its vital activities. It needs do no more to accomplish the purpose of its existence. Even when propagation commences to take place by means of individual male and female parents, the same principle of egoism largely obtains. The spiders are typical instances of this. In their case, the carrying out of the mutual functions of the male spider is attended with much danger for him, owing to the fact that if he does not exercise the greatest care, he is apt to be devoured immediately afterward by his female partner, in order that no useful food matter may be lost. Yet even in the case of the spiders, the female spider already gives proof of a certain capacity for sacrifice where her young are concerned, at any rate for a short time after they have crept from the egg. In animals somewhat higher in the creative scale, more or less powerful feelings of affection may develop out of their sex association. There is affection on the part of the male for his mate, and on the part of the female for her young. Often these feelings develop into a strong, lasting affection between the sexes, and years of what might be called faithful matrimonial union have been observed in the case of birds. This in itself is sufficient to establish the intimate relationship between love in a sex sense and love in a general sense. And even in the animal creation we find the same analogy existing between these feelings of sympathy and their opposites, which occur in the case of human beings. Every feeling of attachment or sympathy existing between two individuals has a counterpart in an opposite feeling of discontent when the object of the love or attachment in question dies, falls sick, or runs away. This feeling of discontent may assume the form of a sorrow ending in lasting melancholy. In the case of apes and of certain parrots, it has been noticed that the death of a mate has frequently led the survivor to refuse nourishment and die in turn from increasing grief and depression. If, on the other hand, an animal discovers the cause of the grief or loss which threatens it, if some enemy creature tries to rob it of its mate or little ones, the mixed reactive feelings of rage or anger is born in it, anger against the originator of its discontent. Jealousy is only a definite special form of this anger reaction. A further development of the feeling of sympathy is that of duty. Every feeling of love or sympathy urges those who feel it to do certain things which will benefit the object of that love. A mother will feed her young, bed them down comfortably, caress them. A father will bring nourishment to the mother and her brood, and protect them against foes. All these actions, not performed to benefit the creature itself, but to help its beloved mate, represent exertion, trouble, the overcoming of danger, and lead to a struggle between egoism and the feeling of sympathy. Out of this struggle is born a third feeling, that of responsibility and conscience. Thus, the elements of the human social feelings are already quite pronounced in the case of many animals, including those of love as well as sex. In the human animal, speaking in general, these feelings of sympathy, love, and duty are strongly developed in the family connection. That is, they are developed with special strength in those who are most intimately united in sex life, in husband and wife, and in children. Consequently, the feelings of sympathy or love, which extend to larger communal groups, such as more distant family connections, the tribe, the community, those speaking the same tongue, the nation, are relatively far weaker. Weakest of all, in all probability, is that general human feeling which sees a brother in every other human being, and is conscious of the social duties owed him. As regards man and wife, the relation of the actual sex instinct to love is often a very complicated one. In the case of man, the sex feeling may, and frequently does, exist independent of love in the higher sense. In the case of woman, it is quite certain that love occurs far less seldom unaccompanied by the sex inclination. It is also quite possible for love to develop before the development of the sex feeling, and this often, in married life, leads to the happiest relationships. The mutual adoration of two individuals, husband and wife, often degenerates into a species of egoistic enmity toward the remainder of the world, and this in turn, in many cases, reacts unfavorably upon the love the two feel for each other. Human solidarity, especially in this day, is already too great not to revenge itself upon the egotistical character of so exclusive a love. The real ideal of sex in love might be expressed as follows: a man and a woman should be induced to unite in marriage through genuine sex attraction and harmony of character and disposition. In this union, they should mutually encourage each other to labor socially for the common good of mankind, in such wise that they further their own mutual education and that of their children, the beings nearest and dearest to them, as the natural point of departure for helping general human betterment. If love, in its relation to sex, be conceived in this manner, it will purify it by doing away with its pettinesses. And it is just into these pettinesses that the most honest and upright of matrimonial loves too often degenerate. The constructive work done in common by two human beings who, while they care lovingly for each other, at the same time encourage each other to strive and endure in carrying out the principles of right living and high thinking, will last. Love and marriage, looked at from this point of view, are relatively immune from the small jealousies and other evil little developments of a one-sided, purely physical affection. It will work for an ever more ideal realization of love in its higher and nobler dispensations. Real and true love is lasting. The suddenly awakened storm of sex affection for a hitherto totally unknown person can never be accepted as a true measure for love. This sudden surge of the sex feeling warps the judgment, makes it possible to overlook the grossest defects, covers all and everything with heavenly hues. It makes a man who is in love, or two beings who are in love, mutually blind, and causes each to carefully conceal his or her real inward self from the other. This may be the case even when the feelings of both are absolutely honest, especially if the sex feeling is not paired with cool, egoistic calculation. Not until the first storm of the sex feeling has subsided, when honeymoon weeks are over, is a more normal point of view regained. And then love, indifference, or hatred, as the case may be, develops. It is for this reason that love at first sight is always dangerous, and that only a longer and more intimate acquaintance with the object of one's affection is calculated to give a lasting union a relatively good chance of turning out happily. One thing is worth bearing in mind. Woman invariably represents the conservative element in the family. Her emotional qualities, combined with wonderful endurance, always control her intellect more powerfully than is the case with man, and the feelings and emotions form the conservative element in the human soul. End of chapter 10. End of Sex. Avoided subjects discussed in plain English by Henry Stanton. This book read by Phil Chenevert.